And we're in Hebrews chapter 10, picking up where we left off last time, which was around verse 26. So we'll be heading in that direction. Again, great to see everyone here. We'll begin our study in a moment. I did have Lori Bowen reach out to me really quick. I guess her sister had an aneurysm. Her sister Mary Ann had an aneurysm and was in the hospital, went through surgery, but is out of surgery. But they're expecting a long recovery. So definitely unexpected there. Let's be praying for her. I'll mention her in the prayer now too. Just want to make sure you were informed, so you're continuing them in your thoughts. So we'll pray for that right now, and then jump right into Hebrews chapter 10. So pray with me, please. Lord our God and Father, we thank you so much for this time now you've blessed us with to be together as your people, those intent on learning from you, of your character, of your greatness, your majesty, O God, but also your love for us, and sending your Son, Jesus, to die on our behalf as that better and perfect sacrifice once for all, to redeem us of our sins and be brought back to you, O God, in reconciliation. We ask, O God, as we open up your word this evening, that we seek from it your wisdom and knowledge, that we can see your blessings, but also heed your warnings, that we never slip away from you nor forsake you, for you have not forsaken us, O God. Help us to have open hearts and open minds, that we may receive this word more readily. And, O God, please be with all of us here in this study now, but also those who cannot be with us, those who are undergoing physical difficulties. We pray for Lori's sister Mary Ann as she undergoes this time. Be with her whole family, that you may provide the healing that only you can provide, and the comfort and consolation that only a God of all comfort can give as well. Please be with us, O God, right now, and help us to have your will on our hearts and our minds, and receive it gladly. It's through your Son's name that we pray. Amen. So we spent our time on a few short verses last time, looking at Hebrews chapter 10, 19 through 25, and I'm glad we did, except at the same time, to lose the momentum as we move on forward for the rest of the chapter would be failing us, so I don't want us to forget it. Just as a quick recap, we looked at verses 19 through 25 and realized here is a transition point. We've had a very long argument, really going all the way back to, you can kind of look at chapter 5 onward till what we've been looking at in chapter 10, all about Jesus's nature of his high priesthood, and there the Hebrew writer in verse 19 gives us, in verses 19 through 21, two key bases upon which we can live within this new and living way, and that is we can have confidence to enter the holy place, and because we have such a great high priest. And so I don't want us to forget that basis for the foundation of what comes forward, because then we have three distinct commands that we are called to, let us draw near with a sincere heart and full assurance of faith, that we are to hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, and to consider how to stimulate one another to love and good deeds. And I will be honest, I wasn't satisfied with the very little amount of time that I left for us to do application. So what I think might be helpful to do is, with those verses in mind, we'll go back to, and we'll do some framing with the rest of this chapter here from 26 and onward. After we get to that point, I want us to make sure we're able to do some application, even what we saw previously, because that point just continues. We got to read the text first. So we're going to go ahead and read verse 26 onward to the end of the chapter. That would be verse 39. So as we look on through this section, really all about the need for endurance. We're not losing that point. We're continuing on from what we saw previously. But if I can have someone read for us verses 26 through 39. Thank you.
For if we go on sinning, deliberately after receiving the knowledge of the truth, there no longer remains sacrifice of sin, but a fearful expectation of judgment, and a fury of fire that no sin can punishment you think will be deserved by the one who trampled underfoot the Son of God and has profaned the blood of the covenant by which he was sanctified and has outraged the Spirit of grace. We know him who said, "Vengeance is mine, I will repay." And again, the Lord will judge his people. It is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. But recall the former days when after you were enlightened, you endured a hard struggle of suffering, sometimes being publicly exposed to reproach and affliction, sometimes being partners with those so treated. For you had compassion on those in prison, and you joyfully accepted the plundering of your property, since you knew that you yourselves have better possessions and an abiding one. Therefore, do not throw away your confidence, which has great reward. For you have need of endurance, so that when you have done the will of God, you may receive what is promised. For yet a little while, and the coming one will come, will not delay. But my righteous one shall live by faith, and if he shrinks back, my soul has no pleasure in him. But we are not of those who shrink back and are destroyed, but of those who have faith and mercy preserve their souls.
Thank you. And I won't say too much because I want to hear from you and your reaction, but quite a tone shift from what we saw, on Sunday morning when we're reading through verses 19 through 25. But it's the same God in whom who've promised, whose promises are faithful, that we see here too in this section. So we'll go into our normal pattern of observation, then we'll get into some of the interpretation, and then really want to spend a lot of time this evening, if we have that opportunity, on the application piece. But what were you noticing in terms of phrases, words, patterns, images that emerge from that section there, maybe especially in contrast with what we saw on Sunday? In a little while? Yeah. So we're going to see that phrase as well as other time phrases that we've been noticing throughout, again, and multiple times. And so there is a urgency in that sense. What else? Profaned. And we haven't had too much talk on phrases like that. But we've had other warnings, have we not? In fact, this is, just to kind of put this into context, this is really the fourth key warning we've seen all the way throughout the book of Hebrews. And we still have one more we're going to get to. And we'll jump back to maybe some of those in a second and see the commonality between what we have here. But too profane, and what does that mean, and what's all entailed in that? Something we might be exploring with some of our other questions in a second. Other words, phrases, patterns you're noticing. Fearful. We had this great joy and confidence in the earlier section, and now fear? It's a terrifying thing to fall in the hands of the living God. Well, those two things aren't exclusive to each other. I think we'll realize that really quickly, but that definitely dominates this section. Other things? So we have, we're supposed to be fearful of God, and then we have this imagery of, where is his wrath? Where is his anger? And how is that described? And we have exactly what we have, the imagery pulled from Isaiah there, mentioned there in verse 27. That should stand out to us because we haven't seen that a whole lot yet, although that's going to come up into play a little bit more as we go on throughout the rest of the book of Hebrews. There's consequence here, right? Other things you're noticing pattern-wise, and I think that does cover a good bit of it, but mm-hmm. And I'm glad you brought that up, because we could look at this whole section and say, God is really negative here. But that would be missing the point, wouldn't it? Because what are the negative actions, as Jeremy just brought up? Who's doing the sinning willfully? Who's trampling underfoot? Who is, as we're going to go through these, regarding as common or unclean the blood of Christ and insulting the Spirit of grace? Well, that could be them. That could be us if we fall into that. Yes. Yeah. Mhm. And that seems justified when you put it that way, when you frame it that way, right?
It definitely seems specific to somebody who has been, sanctified by the blood of the covenant.
Yes.
That's why it's so strong, not just
Yes.
somebody rejecting it upon
Mm-hmm.
has apparently, has been sanctified, has the Spirit, this is somebody
Yes, and do you see other words kind of related to that as well? I'm glad you brought that up, Austin. Other words related to who are we talking about here? Those who had been sanctified. There's a couple other phrases that get brought up there as well. After receiving the knowledge of truth, and there's a whole lot wrapped up in that as well. See other phrases that kind of describe who we're talking about here. Yeah, and so really this is what you see as we see that phrase, joyfully accepted or accepted joyfully in what they've gone through already. So this is not talking about someone who's never heard the gospel before. We are talking about those who have rejected what's before them. Go ahead.
35, it's throwing it away.
Yeah.
Or like 28 years into setting aside a law.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just, okay, you're stumbling in some way, or it's just, hey, here's the law.
Well, that goes back to that willing nature too, deliberate nature, willing nature, and there's a lot of actions involved here. It's not by accident. We're clear on that. I think we'll kind of have some questions on that in a second. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so having that context of verse 25, it kind of makes sense moving on into what we're seeing here. That definitely could be the next outgrowth of those who have forsaken their brethren, forsaken the assembling of them together. But then what's the counter to that? And just one other kind of set of words or phrases that you're noticing here. Yes, the tone shifts, and yes, it does seem like harsh judgment, but righteous judgment from God for those who do these things. But what's the alternative? Struggling is involved here. Keeping suffering. Yet in spite of all that, keeping the faith. And really the key word is what I already had up there. There's a need for endurance. And that's really what gets highlighted here overall. So any other patterns that we kind of missed or glossed over? Again, we're going to dig into what some of these things are and make sure we get questions answered. But I think that gives us a pretty good overview of where we're at. So let's look at these then and take a picture just right there in verse 26. We understand we're coming off of the possibility in verse 25 referring to those who maybe have forsaking the assembling of together, not showing love to the brethren, not encouraging them, not helping them in that endurance factor. And so we start in verse 26, or if we go on sinning willfully after receiving the knowledge of the truth. We've kind of talked about that phrase before, but why do you think that willfully sinning or deliberately sinning there, kind of referenced it already, but why is that distinction so important? What kind of actions, attitudes do you think the Hebrew writer has in mind there in that phrase? Because again, that helps us understand the context. Yeah, Mark.
It's a hard problem. It's not a problem that God is capable.
Yeah.
It's not a problem that provision has not been made. It's not a problem that you don't have confidence. You can't have confidence.
Sure.
No, we have confidence. We have a promise. We have made with an oath that God made by his own name. We made by no one greater, right?
Mm-hmm.
We have all these things. And if we look at that, if we think point, if we pass that away, if we withdraw that, you're just saying, I'm really not.
Yeah. So that clarification helps. And we've seen that in other passages too. Go back to chapter 6. We saw the same idea. It's not that God can't, bring someone back. But that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about someone who's making that decision. And there's a lot of choice here. In fact, we have two choices. 19, we have a new and living way to live by. Or we can reject it all. And that should scare us to a degree. Yeah, Austin?
There's something in this that can also express hope.
Yeah.
Because we know that we are sinners. We know that we need to recognize that currently I am a sinner.
Mhm.
And to see this as this idea that that sitting deliberately no longer has a sacrifice.
Mhm.
Well, that necessitates the idea that there is a sacrifice for my daily understanding.
Yeah.
For my neglect, or for my ignorance, for my
Yes.
areas of growing in, and if I'm not shaking my fist at God and saying no, and I'm trying, there remains a sacrifice for my sin, and I don't need to walk around and say, no, am I saved?
It's something that should exude confidence, exactly. And so as we read passages like this, it's also what gives power to what we just saw before. When you recognize that this is the other side of the same coin. Here's the same God who, yes, will bring righteous judgment on those who reject him. But that actually gives more power to the grace that we saw in verses 19 through 25 on this new and living way. And so, yeah, I agree with you. We have to see the hope in this at the same time. That this is not all it could be. The possibility remains if we make that choice, but that's not the God whom we serve. He gives us that choice and opportunity.
Looking at this, what are we talking about?
Mm-hmm.
The pattern you first, here's what happened. But then in verse 32, what?
Yeah.
And go back and talk about what life is like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that remembrance aspect, which we'll kind of talk about further, like what they did go through, the extent of the sufferings and endurance that they did previously show. Oh, that should bring to mind again, like they could find themselves there, but they have been there before where they have endured. So we don't want to forget that as well. And so I guess my next question is, we've been seeing this a couple of times. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but looking at verse 28 too, as we're trying to figure out how the contrasts are still there. We have law of Moses being brought into play here. Why though? Why bring up this example of 2 or 3 witnesses? Things that we see like over in Deuteronomy 19 as we're looking there in verse 28. Well, why bring up that example? What does that do for the Hebrew writer's argument here?
We're not going to get caught up.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this isn't just being done in a corner or something like that. People have seen it. It's clear. You're being fine about it.
Yes.
And it's a constant process.
And we talked about the nature of the priesthood of the Old Covenant as well. We can go all the way back to Hebrews chapter 5, talking about how every high priest is taken from among men. And in verse 2, he can deal gently with the ignorant and misguided, thinking of the sins that we're doing. That's really what that rule was for. But then here you have sins that are deliberate, that are in the face of everyone else and under the old law. And, well, what happened there? They die without mercy. But really, why is this given here for us? Yes.
How much worse punishment they deserve. The idea being if the law of Moses is superior, way that ultimately right.
Yeah.
You die under the inferior.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, here's your witness, right?
Yes.
Here's the Son of God that you trample underfoot. You outrage the Spirit.
Mm-hmm.
And then here's the Father that's going to come to judgment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Done in the
Yes. Yes, and glad that we're highlighting that too, because that's really what verse 29 29 does for us. It shows how much more severe. But I just wanted to pause for a second and remember, we've seen this kind of language before. Go back to Hebrews chapter 2, and really the first warning that we're given there. This should sound familiar. Going all the way back to the first kind of piece of the argument. Jesus is greater than the angels. He has a sonship there that makes him greater. He's a better messenger. But talking about that message in verse 2 of chapter 2, if the word spoken through angels proved inaudible, and every transgression and disobedience received a just penalty, in that sense, in verse 3, how will we escape if we neglect so great a salvation? And we've seen that language over and over again, but now, after having all of these chapters where it should be solidified for us how much greater Jesus is and how much greater his sacrifice brings, how much greater his message is, it does add a lot more impact to what we see here in these verses, right? How much more severe a consequence. But at the same time, how much greater is his grace and how much greater the salvation that we have through him, right? Both saying the same thing. It just depends on this perspective we're looking at. So then that's there, but as Shane already mentioned, we have these three actions that are descriptive, and as hard as it is a hard pill to swallow as we read this verse 29 there, we have those three statements, and I guess there's a lot to probably be talked about there. I do find it particularly interesting that just how we had those three kind of positive commands to live under the new and living way. Well, here's three ways in which you too can show your just utter disrespect, and honestly, that's a pretty tame word for what we're doing here. Trampling underfoot the Son of God, regarded as unclean or regarding as common the blood. And I guess I have a question just on this one too, because this I guess could provide some confusion. That third one has insulted the Spirit of grace. Any ideas on what that means? What does that look like, I guess? I guess we're getting more in the application territory in some ways, because you can think about all the ways in which these things are done. But I feel like out of the three, that might be the one we're farther understanding in. But yes. Outraged. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The Spirit of grace, the Spirit of God, grace of God, and rejected, treating the Son of God the way that He described, profaning the blood of the covenant, then the Spirit would be outraged.
Yeah. And we look at this, and really they all end up being a picture of the same thing. Of course, the extent to which is highlighted even further for us with those three. But yeah, we can look at the language and we can see, the same kind of language over there that the Hebrew writer uses in chapter 9 and verse 14, talking about how much more will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish to God, cleanse your conscience. So that same thing, how much more, but then also how much more severe are the consequences here. But what is grace? This free gift given, and yet you're trampling underfoot that sacrifice and acting as if this blood that we spent chapters and chapters and chapters on talking about how much better it is than the blood of bulls and goats. But no, it's even more common and unclean than bulls and goats. Now, you can see that's what happens when we go on sinning willfully. And so that makes sense as we go into verse 30 and 31 to see the language there. Vengeance is mine, I will repay, and the Lord will judge. Is a terrifying thing to fall in the hands of the living God. It makes sense as we have these quotations from Deuteronomy 32. And that really brings us, in fact, actually that context there brings us back to what we saw back in chapters 3 and 4, where we had a second warning there of not falling away, not falling back there. But I guess as we see verses 30 through 31, how sure are God's judgments? I won't try to make it a trick question, but how sure are God's judgments? Read any of the books in the Old Testament? A lot more sure than man's, which, as we're going to go into this next section, talking about what has man done to these individuals, we have an outline clearly for us. Well, a lot more sure than man's. But we also had another sense of surety earlier on. Look at the parallel right there in verse 23 of chapter 10. Who is the one who is faithful. He who promised is faithful. So just as God is faithful to his need for justice and judgment, he's also faithful to those blessings. So we're just seeing the same God here throughout. It's us who have to make that choice. So any other questions on 26 through 31? Because I know there is a lot there. I don't want to leave anything undone, but I do want to make sure we get to in some of our application as well as talking about these former days and the more encouraging side of things. But mm-hmm. 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 Yeah, yeah, yeah. It really does. Yeah. Mhm. Yeah, certainly. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I see that parallel, that attitude there too. That might have been present in the audience there in Romans. But again, as we see this, well, it has to be on the basis of what we saw before, where this is this new and living way. Let us do these things. But again, if there is no, why would you do that if there's no consequence? Why would you do that if really you weren't concerned with your brother and concerned with giving to God that sacrifice just as Jesus gave himself for us? Yeah, great point there. Well, let's talk about those former days because that's actually my question. What are we talking about here in verse 32? Remember the former days when all these things happened to you. That doesn't sound like the most encouraging note, yet we're going to see that actually is the very point. But what were these former days? And any ideas with that? Do we have any hints there in those few verses of 32 through 34 really? What was happening to them? Do we know? And certainly we're going to look at Habakkuk 2 and verse 37 through 38. And I guess you could really say that, hey, what they went through, that should be a reminder of whom they're serving. That's for sure.
It would seem that in the early days after they obeyed the gospel, that they endured the suffering willingly, gladly, knowing that it was better.
Yeah.
And that they had this perspective that Christ is coming back quickly. Something that our society today is kind of don't really come.
Yeah, yes. And you can't help but start making application here, which would be my next point. But yeah, what we're seeing here, former days, well, it's after they've been enlightened. That's one of those other words we've seen before. I think we were talking about how they've already been sanctified, right, in this sense. So we understand that they've come to, what do we see in verse 26? Come to the knowledge of the truth. They have come to know that, and yet they still endured. They still went through sufferings, and they did so, accepted joyfully all these different things like being in prison or showed sympathy to the prisoners, the seizure of their property, all these physical things. Yet we know that they understood, at least at that time, like what we see in verse 34, they have a better possession, one that's lasting, one that's not physical, because those things didn't matter. Yet, what's happened? What's happened between those former days and now? And we could probably come up with a long list of things or just kind of presuppose this is what's going on with them. We know that more than likely, going back to verse 25, they're forsaking each other to some extent. Maybe not all of them, but some of them. We have a whole list of warnings that the Hebrew writer tells them to not do. Well, we have one here is mentioning Habakkuk to not shrink back. But what other warnings do you remember from Hebrews so far that he tells us not to do? Stop growing, stop maturing. Certainly we saw that in chapter 6, right? Chapter 5 and chapter 6. What else? What other warnings were given that they ought not do? Hardened hearts, not slipping back. Yeah, I know. We can probably go on and on. You go back to the very beginning, what we saw in chapter 2, right? Drifting away. Falling away in chapter 3. Falling away in chapter 6. Come short in chapter 4. And here they are too. Don't find yourselves there because you've already endured all of these things. Yet, going back to that application, these are the weak Christians, right? According to Hebrews. These are the ones in the former days went through all these things. But they're the ones kind of being warned, and they're the ones who are being chided by not falling into these things. But I look at that list. Not about you. I haven't done any of those things. I haven't gone through any of that. So what does that speak about for me? Now, it's not saying that God's calling us to go through all these specific instances, but consider our sufferings. We're going to consider Jesus' sufferings. We have been. Yeah, where are we in those verses as well? Those are the former days, and they've gone through these moments where they're not so much looking back, but just looking away completely. And so as we get to verse 35 and 36, I think there's an admonition there for us as well as looking for them as well. I think it's kind of interesting that, I'll read this for us really quick one more time, and then I want to hear your comments. Verse 35, therefore do not throw away your confidence, which has a great reward, for you have need of endurance, so that when you have done the will of God, you may receive what was promised. We've been spending, really up to this point, a lot of time looking backwards, right? Looking backwards at the old law, the old covenant, the sacrifices that were done, and to see how much greater Jesus is. But what's the difference here in verse 35 and 36? And why do you think that is? What do we see in verse 35 and 36? Even we apply it to us right now too, and that's fine with me as well, because you can't help but do so. Yeah. We can look back and find confidence in that. Yet that confidence is what also should propel us forward in that endurance and that hope that's before us. And really, we're going to spend a lot of time looking back in the next chapter, so it's not like we're done with that piece. But the underlying message of that is that hope that lies before us, just as it did for them and all these other individuals of faith that we're going to see. And so, yeah, we do have, again, a hope looking forward. But one more admonition in verse 39, that we're not those who shrink back, as Habakkuk says there, and in chapter 2 and verse 3 and 4 of Habakkuk. God takes no pleasure in those who shrink back, who fall away, who drift away, who come short, like we've talked about. But we are of those who have faith in the preserving of the soul. And hey, guess what we're going to talk about next chapter? Faith. Yeah, Austin.
I think it's easy to read that line. I've always read or heard the line, but my righteous must go when the with my faith.
Mm-hmm.
I think just the way we use the word live sounds a lot like I'm going to live day by day by my faith. Mm-hmm. But the context of Habakkuk is not being destroyed by bloodthirsty Chaldeans.
Yes.
I think the best understanding of what is meant by live there is survive.
Yeah, and they should have an understanding of that to an extent because they were threatened in a very physical way before that. And I'll be honest, I have a hard time understanding all of that either. Like we said, like where do you see yourself in those verses? Yet, no, I appreciate you bringing up the context there because that's exactly it. And so in the light of that, in the light of what we saw with the law of Moses, where upon 2 or 3 witnesses you would die without mercy, that really does bring to light what we really saw in verses 19 through 25. And so I want to make sure we get some time for application. We could still bring in some of the other pieces here as well, but really, this is yes for the Hebrew writers. We don't want to forget the audience and the context, so please feel free to bring that in as well. But where do we see us, not just in 26 and onward with the judgment piece and the need for endurance, which is certainly there, but that should add a lot more power even behind those "let us" statements that we saw back in verse 22 through 25. What's the application here? Where do we see us in this? I want to spend the rest of our time on that because I think now more than ever is the time to do so. Yeah. 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 Mm-hmm. Yeah. 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 And I'll add on to that too. If he really meant that that sin once and that was it, then you could pretty much write off the whole other 9 chapters we just read before this because that was the whole point, right? What was the last verse in the last verse in the section talking about this in chapter 10, verse 18, where there is forgiveness of these things, and so great a forgiveness that is. There no longer remains offering for sin. All that argument would have been for naught if that were really the case. And so, yeah, in this is very vivid of imagery that there is on God's judgment. We find hope and kind of joy in that He is the one who provides this mercy, so great a mercy that there is a sacrifice for sins that does cover that forgiveness. Other application. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah. Mm-hmm. 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 Certainly. Sure. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And isn't that interesting too, contrasting the not going on sinning willfully, but going on and enduring on the other hand? That's really the only, I was going to say only 2 options. Really, there's only one option at the end of the day, and that is salvation in Christ. But we're going to make our choice. That's for sure. And if that's a choice, then yeah, go ahead. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I guess that's kind of my next question too is, well, in the context of the Hebrew audience, what was pulling them away? I know we're kind of going off of, we only have the text in front of us, but what would that be? And then where do we find ourselves in maybe those same things? Yeah.
I'm going to abandon everything I understand about
Mm-hmm.
I need for now. That I am in sin. I need It's just not in the same normal category.
No.
That all people are.
Yeah, when there's desire there to learn and grow, we're going to mess up. But that heart piece that we see all the way back in, well, what are we desiring to do? Even with us being here together in verse 24, let's consider how to stimulate one another to love and good deeds. Oh, to perfection? We're never going to mess up at all? No, that's not what that says. In fact, there would be no need for that if that's where we were. But that's ultimately where the heart is at. You know, a symptom of not having the heart there would be forsaking one another, not being there together. But that's not the action. Again, the action is let us consider one another. And the minute that we stop considering is the minute that your heart is hardened, and you're not going to pursue that. In fact, that's going to be another word we see talking about Jesus. We've seen that before, going back to chapter 3 of Hebrews, of considering Jesus, and considering Jesus in chapter 12 as well. Then we stop considering, looking to Him, looking to one another. Then the drifting away is going to come all too quick. Other application, other final moments there, that because I definitely do want to make sure that we're seeing us in this. Yeah. Yes. Mm-hmm. They were made a public spectacle. This isn't just some hidden thing. I'm just minding my own business, and I'm not getting my way in all things. And as you brought up in verse 34, they're showing sympathy to others who are enduring it. Not considering other people, not just themselves. It's one thing to, I can endure when I'm just focusing on how I'm doing. It's another thing to try to endure when you see everyone else around you falling to pieces or undergoing physical duress. But that's what they're called to do. Yeah.
It's interesting if this is actually the Jews and Acts 2.
Mm-hmm.
Because in chapter 4 and 5, they're rejoicing at the fact that they are being made a public spectacle of and everything. And then now you have this apparently a very different attitude toward that.
Yeah.
When it gets back to chapter 2, like, it's this whole, the will of God is that you suffer just like Jesus suffered, and you're reminded of that process. Mm-hmm. We go through and say, instead of being joyful about it, now we're saying, I don't really want to do that anymore. That's part of the life.
Yeah. And that's hard to see that they went through that before and now are here where they're at. Yeah, we know, and I'm glad you brought that up too, enduring suffering joyfully. Don't forget that phrase, because see Jesus did the same thing back over in chapter 12. But when we look at verse 29, this was one final kind of admonition for us as we're kind of wrapping up this evening. We're not of those who shrink back to destruction. We're not of those who shrink back to destruction. That's describing those we saw in verse 26 through 31. So that picture is there as a possibility, but the Hebrew writer says, no, we're not of that kind of mind and attitude and heart, but ones who have faith to the preserving of the soul. And we'll get a better, clearer picture of what that faith looks like when we start talking about chapter 11 and onward, which Shane will pick up there on Sunday morning. So thank you all for your comments, participation, and certainly did enjoy that class.